Welcome to the East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Welcome to the East Angle, a new podcast where two academics working on Japan discuss the history, politics, current affairs, and sports of the so-called East, broadly defined, but with a specific focus on Japan. In each episode, these two academics talk about Japan and the East and East Asia with the help and insights of guests who are mostly, but not always, practicing academics, thinkers, and writers. Our goal is to have informal discussions on a region that usually goes under the radar, especially in this country, and to bridge the divide between academia and the broader society. I am Sherzod Muminov, and I teach Japanese history at the University of East Anglia.
And my name is Ra Mason, and I teach international relations and Japanese foreign policy, also at the University of East Anglia. And in this initial first podcast, we are going to talk broadly about issues of gender in Japan, with a specific focus on the economics, politics, and general changes taking place from the workplace to leadership roles, childcare, and the declining birth rate, as well as other issues that relate to gender, in contrast to here in the UK and elsewhere.
Our guests at today's roundtable are Hannah Osborne and Mami Mizutori. Hannah Osborne is Japan Foundation Lecturer in Japanese Literature at the University of East Anglia. She teaches and researches Japanese literature and culture and is currently writing a book on the work of the Japanese writer Kanai Mieko. Among her many research interests are the avant-garde arts in Japan, women's writing and translation, and gender and body, all of which are directly relevant to the topic of our today's discussion. Mami Mizutori, until December last year, served as the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for disaster risk reduction, a post she assumed in 2018. Prior to commencing her post at the UN, Mami was here in Norwich with us, serving as Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, also known as SISJAC to us. In addition to these important international posts, Mami has had a successful career as a high-ranking Japanese diplomat, working both at the Embassy of Japan in London, but also in Tokyo at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This rich experience, no doubt, provides Mami with a unique vantage point on the topic of today's conversation, but also on broader issues, such as Japan's place in East Asia and the world in cooperation and competition with other powers. Mami and Hannah, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for agreeing to join us. It is great to have you. If I may start with a question to Mami. It surprises no one these days that when we say that Japan is one of the leading nations of the world in terms of economic development, for example, or social welfare, education levels, and other related factors. It's one of the world leaders in life expectancy, as we all very well know, and importantly, healthy life expectancy. It has a relatively low Gini coefficient of about 33, which means it has managed to avoid rampant income inequality, despite decades of high economic growth and fundamental transformations in its economy and society over the past century. It is in the top 25 countries according to the Human Development Index, and in the top 50 according to the GDP per capita, which currently stands at around $34,000 per capita. However, despite all these impressive indicators, when it comes to gender equality, the numbers don't look so good. In the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, Japan is ranked 125th out of 146 ranked countries. It ranks especially low in some sub-indices, for example, in political empowerment sub-index. My question, therefore, is, having attained impressive levels of social and economic welfare, why does Japan struggle when it comes to gender equality?
Well, Sherzod, thank you very much for that important question, and thank you very much for inviting me to this inaugural session of your podcast series. So that's a big question, right? And it is a question that has been bothering me for many years, if not decades. I do feel that at the individual level, And looking at my friends and their daughters, things are getting better. Most of the daughters of my friends, they go to university, they have a job, some get married, but they don't necessarily quit their job. And they have children as well, but then they keep on going. And that's very different from the time when I graduated from university. This was before the so-called gender equality law for employment was enacted. So I think things on that end, when you look at the individuals, it's better. But the indices that you were talking about, women MPs, also women CEOs, women on the board of companies, large, medium sized, even small, um, micro, these are very bad. And why? I do feel that, if I may be very honest, that gender equality is not treated in Japan, even at this point, as a human right issue. And if it's not treated as a human right issue, and if it's not conceived that equality in terms of gender is good for everyone and for the society, then there's going to be a certain obstacle in having more like women MPs, etc. And I do honestly feel that that is the root cause. Of course, we don't have enough women right now in the pipeline because the trend of more women having jobs, being more ambitious, being told to be more ambitious, started rather recently. So let's see if this will change in a few years. But the problem is we don't have much time because, as you say, Ra, the depopulation, aging of the society, etc., is happening, and can gender equality catch up?
Yeah, absolutely. And that note, I'd also like to bring Hannah in and get your thoughts on this, Hannah, because I know you've probably come from a very different perspective, but you spent a long time in Japan. You also have a deep kind of connection to the literature, so you've got that historical perspective. So, how do you perceive it, if you like, coming from the outside in terms of those gender issues?
Thank you very much for the question, Ra, and thank you also for inviting me on this podcast. Yeah, I mean, these are very difficult questions, but I suppose one of the things that I was thinking of when Mami was talking was the issue of rights, and particularly this is one that the thing that gets returned to all the time when we're talking about Japanese women's writing. One thing that always gets talked about um, is the extent to which women had to shed this kind of role as good wives and wise mothers, ryosai genbo. And this is not only an aspect of women's sort of perceived duties or social roles as instructed by the Meiji government, so from sort of prior to the 20th century, but also after, in the immediate aftermath of the war. It's something that gets reconsolidated through actually feminist movements, which are trying to leverage sort of power that they get by being seen as mothers and wives, as supporting roles to the husbands who are working in the city or in the office. And so I think also one thing to sort of really consider with this is the extent to which roles were really segregated. And sort of really feel that in many ways when I look at Japanese literature. And of course, women's literature is segregated from men's literature right up until the 1980s. It's even called something different. And I think that's a huge factor in sort of how women are sort of treated, and what areas they are given to develop as writers, as humans, as workers, and so on.
Sure. So do you think that in that respect, in one sense, Japan is kind of lagging behind, for want of a better word, the West in terms of waves of feminism? I mean, we had traditionally these ideas of wave one, wave two, wave three feminism, of which Wave one was about gaining basic things like the right to vote and, sort of emancipation from being somebody else's property. And wave two is at the level of gaining greater equality. But from what you're saying, Japan is still at that level too. I mean, level three, there's this idea that, well, we need to do more than that. We need to kind of rethink about whose perspective we're coming at and include many more actors than just women. But do you feel that there's a sense in which Japan is kind of stuck in that 80s or 90s mindset when it comes to addressing gender equality?
I mean, it's really difficult to sort of generalize, and I sort of feel like the issue is so complex and difficult to unpack. But I'd like to start by trying to understand that word equality.
Mm,
I mean, what does it actually mean? And this gets sort of asked really in the 60s and 70s by new women writers arriving on the scene. What does it mean to be equal when there is a perception of difference at the same time, or an acknowledgement of difference? And in some ways, I'd also like to bring to light that although obviously there are sort of gender inequalities when we look at working patterns and so on, there's also this sort of difference of what men and women are able to do. So one of the striking facts that I was presented with recently was the fact that in terms of audience attendance for kabuki theatre, it's primarily women who are going to theatre, because men do not have the time to do that. So I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways, and this is often sort of said, women have greater leisure time, and that might be perceived by some people, by women themselves, perhaps, to be a good thing.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, that was a great answer, and also your answer brought, like, I'm wearing my historian's hat here, brought to mind the points about women's issues not being a very recent thing. Although some of the positive developments that Mami-san you've mentioned are fairly recent. We can go back to Taisho period, for example, the period, for those of you who know Japanese history, is between 1912 and 1926. The brief window of Taisho democracy, in which you had phenomena such as moga, or a brief abbreviation of modern go, modangaro in Japanese, who really went against this Ryosai Kembo, good wife, wise mother ideal, who actually openly resisted it by wearing Western dress, frequenting cafes particularly in very trendy places like Ginza, and actually refusing to comply with the gender uh, norms or gender expectations of the society, which basically, again, to say it shortly, Japanese feminism and Japanese movement for equality is not something recent. It has deep historic roots. But to go back to the question of what is equality, I'd like to ask Mami-san, how do you see that equality from your own perspective, and considering also your own experience? You did mention that things are changing. If you go back to your period, the period you graduated from university and started your career, and now, uh, when you say the changes, what has changed? But then, more importantly, what changes would you personally like to see for equality, as you see it, to be established in Japanese society, gender equality?
So I'd like to start by picking up what all three of you said. It's about different, right? And I'm thinking about diversity and conformity. One big issue in Japan, I do believe, and this is not only about gender, is that diversity is not seen as a positive thing. So it's more than we're stuck in the second wave of women lib movement or whatnot. Conformity is what people, women, men, old people, well, I shouldn't say old people, right? Senior citizens, but even young people, they strive for. And I think that is what is making it very difficult, because you mentioned about Moga, and you mentioned about women live. But I do still think that in Japan, these people are seen of exceptions. People who were very liberal, who were out of the box, and it's not seen as a progression. So what I would like to see, trying to answer your question, is an embracement of diversity, that people can be different. People need to be different, and people should be able to express their difference and hence bring a richness to the society. That is what I think is needed. And we still have a tendency in Japan to try to be as conformative as possible. And I think that's a big obstacle, a cultural one, societal one, that is very difficult to overcome.
So do you think that it is that cultural conformity that also has an impact on issues, for example, like LGBTQ plus rights? Is there a direct relationship between the fact that, for example, both legally and socially, there is still major issues in Japan with gaining equal rights for those communities vis-a-vis, the so-called straight community, for example?
Absolutely. Now, we all know that in Japan, even today, married couples cannot have different surnames. And the concept of a family, which is very strong, especially in the leading party, the Liberal Democratic Party, is that a family must consist of a father who is a man, a mother who is a woman, and then several children, and the role that you were talking about, Hannah, different roles. And I don't think this is particularly a universally conservative thing, because in this country, in the United Kingdom, David Cameron, as a conservative prime minister, he legalized gay marriage. So there's something inherent in the Japanese, I don't know, history, tradition, whatever you can call it, that makes it very difficult for even couples to have different surnames. Then LGBTQ plus is something that is even beyond.
I mean, this is fascinating because isn't there also, Hannah, a very rich history actually of LGBTQ literature within, or at least a form of it within Japanese literature? I mean, not explicitly, but the kind of gender roles and the roles of various actors, or is that something where you think, is that like a hidden literature, or is it something where it's acceptable within certain contexts? I mean, Sherzod mentioned kabuki, I think, or those kinds of.
Anna mentioned kabuki.
Oh, really? Sorry. So I mean, is there something there where it's like it's there, but we're just not allowed to talk about it?
So you're sort of referring to onagata and stuff like
Yeah, all
that
this
in
kind of
the,
thing,
you
right?
know, so the fact that in kabuki theatre, all roles are played by men, so therefore even the female figures are played by men. And then this has developed into a culture where onagata are, I don't know, it's difficult to sort of, I don't want to generalize, but they are perceived as being effeminate men, or maybe even gay, but there's not that. I think that is a sort of wrong illusion to make, and there's the element of performance that's on in here, and so to what extent that connects to that actor's actual sexuality is also not clear, and whether that actor actually comes out as gay is another matter entirely. And my sense is that that knowledge is sort of, well, that acknowledgement is not made explicitly, is not sought after even, and I think, I mean, in general, in my experience of sort of performers that seem perhaps overtly sort of LGBT to me, I remember asking my Japanese parents-in-law in Japan and sort of making a comment on this. And there was just a sort of flat refutation of the fact, it's like, no, they're not. There's no way. And so I thought that was kind of surprising. I think there's a sort of gap between the concept of, or the fact of people performing in certain ways and then coming out and actually declaring yourself to be LGBT.
Hannah, may I
Yeah.
ask a question that actually is related to theater, but also, if we so wish, we can basically expand it and link it to what's going on in society. And the question basically relates to artistic form. And I'm assuming, again, I'm not an expert, that breaking out of artistic forms or abandoning certain artistic traditions must be even harder than, for example, shedding the conformism of in the society, because especially considering Japanese art forms which have been maintained for a long time, be it kabuki or so. I have a friend, Esra Gökçe Şahin. She's Turkish, but she became a rakugo master, and she tells a story of how she went to a male rakugo master in Tokyo, and he immediately, not immediately, scrap that, but when he saw her and when he heard her request, out of hand, he said, "You're a woman, so you can't be a rakugo master." So I guess the question is, we might really kind of see a parallel there, uh, not just in Japanese society, in every society, we all play certain roles. And obviously, I did mention in the previous question, gender roles, gender expectations to which we all kind of, uh, try to associate ourselves with. Would you say that in art it's harder to break out, and would there be like some kind of clues in that to what's going on in society?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, yes, this is something, I mean, obviously I look at a lot, and in terms of women's literature and in Japan, and I mean, obviously, it depends how far back you want to go, but let's just take the, from the 1920s specifically onwards, since you talked about Taisho, and you have this emergence of the I novel, which, as it happens, is sort of a very masculine form of writing. And why is it so? Not because actually, in terms of the textual materiality, it differs from women's writing. The I novel are novels where male authors talk about their life experiences and try to locate a sort of interior voice. And the idea is that they are some way able to present themselves in a sort of very direct, immediate way to the readership. And there's always a sort of meta discourse around the novel whereby critics sort of come in and say, oh, of course, this novel is referencing this event, that event, the other event that happened in the actual novelist's real life. And so this is an I novel. And this is a really good representation of Japaneseness, of Japanese life. And women are positioned absolutely outside of this ability to define what Japaneseness is, because they, even if they write about autobiographical aspects of their lives, even if they share the same literary techniques as the men, they're never categorized as I novels, especially during this time, even in the post-war era. And in fact, from this point onwards, from the 1920s onwards, there's this sort of emergence of this term, Joryu bungaku, which actually literally means female stream literature. And so they're categorized separately. They're even found in bookstores separately, in a separate section of the bookstore entirely. And I think it's sort of really, it's only in the 1960s and 70s that there starts to be a backlash against this. And women, as you may know now, have really sort of captured the global literature market. And they've done so extremely cunningly, sort of almost by, I don't know, doubling down on that niche of how they were categorized, but exploiting it so cleverly. I won't talk about it now because I'll just go on forever.
That's fascinating,
but
Hannah.
yeah,
Just one thing I want to mention before I give it to Ra to ask the next question is, it's fascinating that women were seen, and I find it fascinating that women were not allowed to participate in shaping the literary scene, considering that Japan is the country where perhaps the world's
Yeah.
first novel was written by a
Yeah.
woman. I'm talking about Murasaki
Yeah.
Shikibu,
Yeah.
The Tale of Genji. Which is, again, once again, brings us back to what women are allowed. Somehow women are always on the receiving end, aren't they? Somehow women are seen as, belonging in the private, not in the public. Women, all of those other gender norms and expectations that are normally imposed to women, which uh, unfortunately is continuing to this day in some aspects in society. However, at least in literature, I guess, again, this is my kind of layman's view, but if you take 100 novels, Japanese novels, translated into English, a good portion, probably much more than half, would be by women authors, which I think is, I have recently enjoyed, Kawakami Mieko books, or I've enjoyed Murata Sayaka's books, and etc. etc. But
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating about listening about this is, apart from anything else, you wonder how these conditions have taken place. And I wonder if one of the aspects is to do with education. So if I might ask Mami your experiences of this, how we get from a position of legal equality and transformation, as you talked about, in areas that matter a lot, like high politics and international relations. How is it that we see Japan positioned in a what we might describe as equivalent scenario to other OECD countries, and yet there isn't that catch up of women in positions of power and, to a certain extent, influence? Is that coming through the education system? Is this about how gender is taught in schools? Or is there some kind of culture within, for example, the foreign ministry or the government that prevents or influences those young talents coming through who've had a more equal education?
So, in terms of education, definitely when I was growing up and was born in 1960s, um, there was this thing that, Hannah, you mentioned Ryosai Kenbo, which means in English, good mother, no, good wife, wise mother. And there were, I still remember, some girls only schools which prided themselves for having that kind of an education. I think that is quite gone. However, I have to say that I was born and raised in Tokyo. So maybe what I'm thinking about, what I'm saying, does not represent the whole of Japan. Because a very interesting phenomena, and I just read it yesterday, is that by 2050, they say, and this is a report which was compiled by a wise people's group around strategic population programs, etc., something like that. 40% of Japanese cities will go away. Why? Because all the women of these cities between the age of 20 to 39, I think, the number will be reduced to half. And why is this happening? Because basically a lot of young women, they are leaving their villages, whether it's in the northern part or the southern part of Japan, and they come to Tokyo or another big city. And so that, I think, does mean that, yes, probably in terms of education, but also after that employment, etc., there must be quite a big difference on how these things are taught or perceived between the larger cities and the cities in not only remote areas but outside these cities. But I do believe that, having said that, now in terms of higher education, the percentage of female and male is almost the same, 50-50. So there is hope there. But the difficulty I see is this. Previously, it was women get married at a certain age, they stop working, they have children. Now, more women work, but they have stopped getting married. And what does this tell us? I just feel that, and this is not only for women, the notion of what we talk about a lot here and in all Western societies, work-life balance, does not exist. So it means that previously women got married, and that was not, I shouldn't say it, but that was the way that you should be. Now they don't want to get married because they don't want to get into that role of just being that good wife and wise mother, but they feel that be I can't have a nice life being married and working. And that I think is a problem.
So do you think that that is because, is that top down or bottom up? Because there was this famous set of policies, particularly under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who had this idea of, you know, the Josei ga kagayaku shakai, right? The society where women shined. And cynics would say that is part of exactly what you're talking about, where actually it's co-opting relatively cheap, malleable labor into a neoliberal model and exploiting that to the max. Doesn't matter whether you're male, female. If you're female, it's just a way of co-opting you into that economic model.
I couldn't have said it better. I think you're absolutely right. The reason why the government's different prime ministers started to talk about this issue is because A, there is not enough manpower or people power, whatever, in the labor market. And this is the problem. You know, they're only seeing this gender equality or whatever you call it from the lens of, oh my God, what should we do? We don't have enough children. We don't have enough workers. We're going to age. So what shall we do? Oh, we should have 30% of the boards of companies filled by female women, etc. And again, I will go back to my first uh, point that I mentioned, that it is not seen as an individual right. It is not seen as a way of enriching the society and making everybody happier and better.
It's ironic, isn't it? Some of the things that you've mentioned, but also looking back into the history, what we could call emancipation, which I probably shouldn't call emancipation because it again kind of reasserts the idea that women are receiving on the receiving end of things. But whatever we call it, basically the spread of consciousness, spread of awareness about gender rights, the increase in number of female students, increase in number of independent, economically independent women, should we put it that way, creates somehow, rather unexpectedly or rather unpredictably, another problem for the Japanese society, which is, as you just mentioned, lots of young women decide to go to urban centers. They decide to get a job, and once they get a job, obviously they think twice before agreeing to getting married. And in the Japanese context, not always, but often, getting married to a man means getting married into a family, and you have to really kind of work and live within that family structure and conform to even more roles and expectations. So, if we can turn it slightly from the individual's viewpoint to the nation state's viewpoint, and Mami-san, you did mention some of the things that, some of the thinking, you did reveal some of the thinking of the bureaucrats, or of say, politicians in Japan. How does the Japanese government currently see it? And how does the Japanese government or Japanese bureaucrats, politicians view the problem? And what do you think is wrong with that view?
I do think that the biggest problem is that they are not addressing the root cause of why young people these days in Japan do not want to get married, do not want to have children. It's not only about the money, right? You know, of course, you know, you need money to have more children and raise them well, etc. So financial support from the government, subsidies do do work to a certain degree. But I think they're missing a point in really analyzing and understanding why is it that the younger generation in Japan, women, but not only men too, I think to a certain degree, do not want to um, do not want to get married, have children, do not see this as a way to live happily. Uh,
And why do they not want that? If you could just, from your perspective, how
well,
do you
well,
see it?
because I think I think the work life balance is a big issue. I mean, there is the work, the demand at your workplace is just so so much, and it's in every sector. Civil servants, academics, even. You know, I think you guys know about
Yeah.
this, right? Because you have had
At least
you,
academia, we know.
you
Yes,
have
I guess.
spent
Yeah.
time there, right? It doesn't really matter in which industry you are in. There's such a demand that people are exhausted, and they just feel that it's impossible to get married, have children, care for their children. And by the way, talking about this, I saw a OECD report saying that among all the OECD countries, uh, the the men in Japan dedicate the least hours to household chores, which is shocking, but not shocking because we know that's the truth. And this is also coming back to what you meant about the role, right? And basically, and again, education. Boys are not educated by their mothers to be part of the household in a way of sharing the burden of the chore, etc. So I think all these things, and I would say one more thing: we need to talk more about these things. In Japan, the big problem is that there's a big issue there, and there's an elephant in the room, but we don't. And unless we start talking about these things, it's not going to change.
Well, that's good news that we are
Yes,
today.
yes,
And
absolutely.
if I could throw it back to you as well, Hannah, because I'm wondering, is it reflected? Is it talked about, for example, in the literature? Do you see changes
yeah.
and trends
Yeah.
where that's very apparent?
Yeah. I mean, just to go back to education for a moment, first, the reforms after the new constitution of Japan in the immediate aftermath of World War II were crucial because women, along with other marginalities, were given, uh, opportunity to have a full and equal education alongside boys or men, and to enter university courses alongside men. So, actually, what this resulted in, many women then after the war took courses in literature and foreign literatures. And so it seems very coincidental, or perhaps not at all, that many leading women authors of the 60s and 70s, very radical writers, Takahashi Takako, Kurahashi Yumiko, Tsushima Yuko, for instance, they all gained degrees in foreign literatures from major universities. And then they began writing and writing really radically. So, in terms of producing literature, education was very sort of crucial, I think, to women developing not only sort of uh, knowledge about literature, but also strategies, how to present themselves, how to write back. Um, so I think that's a sort of, I mean, education is, yeah, obviously such a crucial um, aspect of writing and reading. Um, but wait a minute, what else were we talking
So
about?
I guess I wanted to know if there was a shift now. Like we see so much, for example, you look around the campus here where we are today, University of East Anglia, and you will see a concerted effort to, for example, promote transgender rights, promote issues of gender more broadly. And there is a certain degree in which that is picked up as part of the muse, part of the contemporary
Yeah.
culture, and
So
yeah.
can I cut in? Yeah,
Yeah,
because
please do.
I sort of remember what I was going to say. I mean, in terms of more contemporary women writing and several of the women that are bestsellers in English today, what they're writing about is what Mami was sort of really referring to, was the fact that when they go to these workplaces, there's a sort of choice presented to them, and uh, they are sort of asked either they either have to sort of pursue a lifestyle where they are single and they are working, and perhaps they have a career in mind, perhaps they have creative pursuits that they want to follow, and to do that they can't really have a family as well. And I think particularly the more ambitious professions, it's very difficult to juggle that and motherhood and myself, personally speaking as well. I mean, I think it's difficult in any country. If you're a mother and you're pursuing a sort of job which requires a lot of your time, that balancing act is difficult. But I think in Japan, many women, certainly many women that I know of and women writers, give up on trying to achieve that. For instance, Emi Yagi, who came, she presented in Norwich last year. I was interviewing her and in discussion with her, and she said when she got married, she is married, her mother-in-law said to her, I want you to have 3 children. So she went away, and one of the first things that she did was produce her first child, in inverted commas, i.e. she wrote about this sort of phantom pregnancy
Is
called
it Diary
Diary
of
of
a
the
Void?
Void.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
and the
yes. I was
void
going to
is
ask you, yes.
the phantom pregnancy.
Kushin Techo,
Um,
something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yes,
Which is a play on Bosh
yes,
Techo,
yeah.
like a child and mother booklet that they
Right.
give out in
Yeah.
Japan
Right,
when you
okay.
have a baby. I think that's what it is,
Yeah.
if I remember it correctly.
Yes.
Sorry to
yeah.
interrupt.
No, not at all. No, I mean, I think I sort of was finishing my point really, but yeah, I do notice that, and with my sort of friends in Japan as well, that
So-
there's a straight choice between motherhood or a more significant working role.
When I first went to Japan as a graduate student, I was absolutely enthralled with the country, with its literature, with everything Japanese. I still am, although I guess with experience I've become a bit more critical. At the time, again, trying to link the topic of literature with all the problems that we've noticed and trying to turn it into a question now. I think a Belgian writer called Amélie Nothomb, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think she wrote a novel called, this is one of the novels I read at the time, called Fear and Trembling. And it is, without spoiling it, to kind of just briefly, the summary of the novel is a Western woman goes to work in a Japanese company. And the novel satirizes it all. But at the time, I remember I was absolutely infuriated because I loved Japan so much. When I read that novel, I thought, no, Japan can't be so bad. It's because of you. You stupid foreigner. That was my thing. And myself, of course, being a stupid foreigner. But this leads kind of to the question of listening to Mami. I got the idea that a lot of the problems that we are discussing, again, I don't want to overly generalize, but the problems that we're discussing tend to spring from the work culture. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the issues, this mistreatment of women in the workplace, which is really, if you really want to read that novel, you will get a lot of that in the Fear and Trembling, but also in other novels, for example, Murata Sayaka or Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, Konbini Ningen, I think is the Japanese title. So the question then is, do you think, Mami-san, changing work culture might be the first step in leading Japan towards greater equality between genders.
I think that is a very valid point. And this report that I just mentioned, which was produced by the Jinko Senryak Kaigi, which would be translated into the group of people thinking about population issues strategically, does say that it's not only the role of the government to look into this. Companies have to really think about their strategies, their culture, if we Japanese want to tackle the depopulation issue. And I think this is exactly what you're saying. And this is what is at the core of the issue, I do believe. And if we can change this, I think we can change.
And can I add to that point?
Please do.
That I think the working culture is a big problem for men as well. And I mean, I know several men, Japanese men, personally, and who have suffered greatly from the very aggressive working culture, and tragically. And so I think it's an issue that actually affects both, men and women. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's about, and you mentioned that you see, looking at your girlfriends, a dichotomy of people who said, okay, I'm going to focus on my work, my career. These women, and I must confess that I was like that until I got married quite late in my life, are just following the pattern of a majority of the men, the successful men up to now, the Japanese work.
I think some of this might relate as well to, again, what we define as success, right? I mean, we talked about defining equality. I think maybe we should also think about what it means to be successful. If I might, on that note, Sherzod and I, much as we love Japan, we also love sports, and in particular football, and we always add a little portion of sport. And in that regard, I wonder if we could pick up on Nadeshiko Japan, which is the phenomenon equivalent to the Lionesses in the UK. So the Japanese female national football team. And I wonder if they might be a shining example of something which has gone from almost being unknown about to being one of the most loved and famous sporting icons in the country. Do you think that's a significant step, or is it just an anomaly and a blip because they happen to be very good?
Just to give a little bit more context for the listeners, Nadeshiko Japan, the female team, are a lot more successful than the men's team because they have won the World Cup.
They have.
And they have broken, and I think if memory serves, this was the 2012 Women's World Cup, if I remember it correctly.
Either 2012 or 2008. We'll double check.
No. It must be 2012 because I remember in the final, which was against the United States women's national team, which is the strongest, historically the best women's national team in the world, and had been for a long time. So they had won successive World Cup titles, and Nadeshiko Japan won the 2012 or 2013. I might be mistaken about the year the World Cup because the coach played the video of the 3/11 disaster, and to rally to basically inspire the young women who then went on to win the final, which was an incredible story. Which one of the reasons that they became so popular around the world was their resilience, that against all odds that they went out and they won against the world's strongest team.
No, I think that's this is a great story, and if I remember correctly, London Olympics, Nadeshiko Japan was a finalist, right? They didn't win, but they were a finalist. But this is the interesting thing. So the men who fared much worse traveled to and back to Japan business. And Nadeshiko Japan, they traveled in economy class. And I think this is also quite interesting because it was probably maybe, there wasn't enough budget and they thought, okay, men playing football is more important, so they have a right to be on the business class and women not. Interestingly, for the Paris Olympic, Nadeshko Japan has already qualified to be playing at the Olympic, whereas the men's team it's not certain yet, right? I do believe that, sports can change the mindset of many people, and especially young people, right? They see, and it's the same here as the lioness. Young girls see these, brilliant heroes and understand that, okay, we can do this. We can be as good as men. We can be better than men, maybe. And these are, and it's part of the education, isn't it? It's a great way of positively influencing the mindset of girls. So yeah, I think it's a great story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, we I think sports wise, we I think we are hoping this it will become a fixture that towards the end. However, strange that might seem that having discussed difficult topics, we tend to turn to football. So
It's a
maybe
nice way to make us feel happier.
I guess, but
Yes.
maybe with a one more question, I would like to just once again maybe expand a little bit on the sports theme. I think we have some time, a little bit more time, because if you consider the Japanese sports culture, the probably the most popular sport. Uh, Obviously, it depends on the demographic, but sumo is up there among, I guess, male demographic. But if you think about specifically uh, sports where women have done really well, besides football, one thing comes to mind, and figure skating comes to mind. And figure skating, of course, we have people like Asada Mao, who historically has been quite good. We have now the male Hanya Yuzuru
Well, I
is
think
is
Asada Mao and Ando Miki, right?
Ando
I
Miki.
mean, a
Yes, of
complete
course.
legend
Yes,
and now a regular broadcaster. So
yes.
sorry, let's continue.
No, that's fine. The point I was trying to make is that, or the question rather I would like to ask is, Nadeshiko being one instance uh, that shows to young women or to society in general that women can and will lead the society in their not only in how they achieve or what they achieve, but also in serving as examples to young people that everything is possible. That if you put your heart you and put your mind to it, then you can actually really make those changes. Because the reason why I'm bringing this up is a lot of our talk from the start of the podcast was we kind of tended to talk about some of those unbreakable roles, unbreakable things, unbreakable barriers within the society, the rigidity
The
of
glass ceiling.
the glass ceiling is a good metaphor, which is often employed in when people talk about gender inequality. Maybe sports might be one way, or maybe other ways in which the people's thinking will change because policies might change or politicians' approach might change. Um, Companies might come in, Keidanren and other associations might do a bit more for their social responsibility and chip in. But ultimately, what I gathered from what you've said is that people's thinking has to change. So, what are their ways? Not only in sports. I mean, I use sports as an entry point, I guess, to develop this question in my mind. But the question is to both guests. Besides that, what hope is there for a changed mindset or changed approach to gender equality?
Please go ahead, Hannah.
Well, I mean, I can only well, I can't only, but I particularly am thinking of literature. I mean, I think in the sense that, you've had, well, you know, a situation where men have dominated not only what was taken seriously and canonized in Japan and considered the um, key works of modern Japanese literature for decades. Um, women have started to infiltrate that, win sort of the big literary prizes. And actually, if you look at the Akutagawa Prize, I mean, that they're given fairly evenly from the mid 1960s onwards, and I'm not sure whether that was a sort of concerted effort on behalf of the prize givers, but to both men and women. But so you've had a real rise of Japanese women's literature, and the stuff that women are writing is extremely critical of society and extremely critical of gender issues and issues concerning women, the way women are conceived of in such a sort of pigeonhole way, the way the expectations of society are that they're going to get married and have children, that they're reduced to just being a body. And I think through literature, women really are able to challenge all those ideas, and as are men. And now you have a situation where globally, women are overtaking like the likes of Haruki Murakami in terms of sales, and so yeah, I think literature is one major way in which we can challenge these ideas, um, and I think it's quite an interesting aspect of this whole gender conversation that literature is that arena which is very sort of democratic, and you have a large voice for women.
Obviously, the role of sports and literature and art, very important to change how societies, how individuals, people or address, try to solve these big issues. I would say the most important thing for me is politics, because it is the politicians, it is the legislative body, in the case of Japan, the Diet, which can provide a structure of legislations, which can give tax incentives, which can make rules that can change the way that the society moves forward. So I do believe that the fact that we have so few female politicians is something that needs to change. And it has to change not at the election, that's too late. The way that parties, and I think it's already, they're doing it here in this country and many other countries too, the way that parties select their candidate for a certain constituency, that I think is very important. And if we can change this, I think ultimately we can change a lot of things. But just to end on a bit of a positive note, because I don't want to sound like this Japanese person who lives outside Japan and criticizes everything about the country, because that's absolutely not what I'm trying to do. Look, Japan has shown its strength in times of crisis, right? The Meiji Restoration, the after the Second World War, and now I think the country is in real deep crisis, and a lot of people are cognizant of this. And reading the newspapers, listening to people in Japan, I do feel that there is a real sense of we need to change the way that we are conducting our lives. We are taking forward or not the society. So I do have hope, and I'm really glad that you chose this issue as the first topic for this podcast series, because it is.
Yeah, I think we are too, and we're absolutely amazed and fascinated to hear what you're saying on this. If I could add just one last point or ask a last question about that hope, because is that also something which is going to be driven by technological change? We've got all this technological change. You mentioned that there was the urbanization effect, and that some of these things are very specific to Tokyo. as you know, I spent a long time in Okinawa, which is the most peripheral area. And there's often a big divide between rural areas like Okinawa and central areas like Tokyo. So could it be that social media, technological change, all of this kind of encompassing of the whole country, could that actually bring people together as part of that?
I think it can. Telecommuting, you don't have to be in Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya to to work. You can live in Okinawa. You can have a better, quality of life there. Have a family with a lot of children, but also have a job that is you can also have a job that is very relevant to you. So I think technology can help. And we are now seeing more people trying to move. I mentioned that young women moving into the big cities. But once you have a family, we are seeing not in a great scale, but more families trying to find a better life outside Tokyo with quality of life, and technology there is going to be a big.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank both our guests, Mami-san, Hannah. Thank you very much for your insights. It was wonderful. I think we had a good conversation on various aspects of this issue, gender equality, and the roles of different actors and stakeholders. And I would like to also thank my co-host, Ra.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much indeed to our two guests.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to the next episode.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.